well, thank you very much. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're on Noongar land and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm very excited to be here tonight. I'm even more excited because I managed to put together 12 photographs that I took myself. So anybody that thinks that lawyers just sit in libraries and read books, it's not quite true. They do occasionally let us out of the library. And these are pictures that I took in the course of my research, where I think that you definitely need to see what it is you're trying to protect with the law and policy. So what I want to do today is just to give a brief, very fast historical overview of the development of the law of the sea, the international law of the sea that we have today, because that really provides a foundation for the other treaties and the other laws that we've tried to put in place to protect marine species. Then I'm going to talk briefly about some of the marine environmental laws that we do use, and then finish by looking at three key challenges at the moment and how we're addressing them, and how the law is addressing them, and on what basis. So the first thing, of course, to say is that this is a blue planet, and 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. But because people don't live in those areas, they live on land. It's tended to be land that we've noticed the first problems, and that we've passed and adopted the first laws to protect those environments. Of course, people have relied upon food from the oceans and resources from the oceans for hundreds of years. But it's only really in the last 500 years that we've started to develop any law beyond very local or small national contexts. So the law of the sea is probably one of the oldest areas of law compared to others, but still only about 500 years old. And there's been this ongoing tension between government authority over the oceans and the freedom of the seas. And the pendulum swings back and forward, but it's certainly the freedom of the seas that has dominated. So you can go back as far as you want if you want to look at the law of the sea, and I won't go back too far, but it's quite clear that in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, there were laws in relation to the Mediterranean Sea that went beyond the near shore of those countries. So the Romans, and I promise not to mention too much Latin, but the Romans governed, in a sense, those areas using the concept of res communis, which was the seas are basically free and open to all. So there's no doubt the Romans did try and control some of the oceans, but they didn't claim ownership of the oceans and all the resources in them. And so we see this open access approach, this concept arising very early and coming through year after year, century after century. But around the 13th century, the pendulum swung a little bit back the other way. It was in Venice. I think Venice claimed ownership of the Adriatic and actually levied ships to travel across the Adriatic because they claimed that they owned it. And they did that for quite a long period of time, and countries did accept that for a period of time. But when we get to the 15th century, with 16th century, where we have much more oceanic exploration, and we see Spain and Portugal travelling much greater distances, this concept of any private property ownership over the oceans dissipates. And we start to see this freedom of the seas come through again. But then we get to this treaty, the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494, where the Portuguese and the Spanish, who were by far the greatest seafaring nations at the time, divided up the whole planet in two, just between them then. So Spain had, as you can see, the Americas, they owned all of that, and Portugal owned the rest. And these were the sort of the routes on which they were exploring at the time, but a slightly arrogant approach, I would say, and doesn't really take into account what anybody else wanted to do. So that was 1494, and then moving forward a little bit, this is when we really see the law of the sea starting to emerge. So in response to this concept that two countries could own all the waters in the world, we see the British, Dutch and French exploration, and then their concern about these claims. And it really was in response to these claims of ownership that Grotius wrote Mare Liberum, which is the freedom of the seas. So he wasn't the person to invent that, because you could date it right back to Roman times, but he re-established it. And originally, his treatise actually talks about freedom of navigation only. But as there started to be more debate about what the freedom of the seas meant, this freedom of navigation through waters expanded to freedom to fish, freedom to take any resources that you wanted from the ocean without any restriction. So that was Grotius, and he's the most famous, really, of all these writers in this area. But John Selden, who was British, took a slightly different approach. He said, no, it's not that you can't have any property rights in the ocean. You can have some property, you can have some ownership, but it has to be quite limited. And around that time, you see the British claiming that, I think James I claimed that you could own waters as far as a ship could be seen into the distance. So that was a swing back, a sort of response to Grotius, and that the oceans were all free. By the time we get to Cornelius van Binkershoek, and I'm not entirely sure that's how you pronounce it, he's the person who said, well, a nation can own, he took an in-between position. So he said a nation can own a small portion of the coastal waters that it can control. And this is where you get the famous cannon shot rule. It was the origin of the cannon shot rule that said you can control as far as you can fire a cannon from the coast. And so this is the origin of the 3 nautical mile limit, which persisted for a very long time. And that's why it's known as the cannon shot rule. So you see this crystallising over time. So again, over decades, and I won't go through all of the law here, but over decades you see this crystallising into the territorial sea. The concept that, in general, the seas are free for everybody to access, to navigate across. But in this small passage of coastal water, 3 nautical miles from the coast, a country has ownership of that territorial sea, subject only to the right of innocent passage. And the right of innocent passage is you can freedom to navigate through those areas, providing you're not doing anything naughty or threatening those nations. So that's pretty much how the law developed over the next couple of 100 years until you get to the 20th century. And of course, we've got a very different time by then. Certainly by the 1890s, fishery resources were beginning to be depleted. Now, one of the arguments for freedom of access to ocean resources, freedom to fish anywhere you liked, is the fact that it wasn't really believed that we could exhaust the resources in the ocean. It was believed that there'd be plenty of resources for everyone, so we didn't really need to worry about this. Now, when we get to the 1890s, even in Australia, even in Western Australia, they were starting to have fisheries regulation because fisheries were being depleted in some areas. And globally, certainly in the areas around Europe, that was more profound. So by 1930, we have the first, what we would call a global conference, an international conference of countries. So this is before the United Nations, this is the League of Nations, but we have this Hague Codification Conference. And codification here really means what they were trying to do was to crystallise the rules about the territorial sea and write them down and get everyone to sign them in a treaty so there was no argument. Because although this 3 nautical mile limit had crystallised with some countries, others were not quite sure 3 nautical miles is what they wanted. Now, this didn't really work the way it was intended to work, because during this conference it became quite clear that they weren't going to get agreement on 3 nautical miles, and so there was no codification. There was an agreement, there was a territorial sea, but the extent of it wasn't clear. By the time we get to 1945, this is obviously beginning of the United Nations. The League of Nations had not been successful. The United Nations was formed, and we get the Truman Proclamation. And I've put the quote there on the slide for you. So we get, again, claims to this territorial sea, and then we get specific rules, countries trying to make rules for the protection and preservation of fishery resources. Again, not really through any altruistic desire to protect the environment, but more to protect the livelihoods and the food security issues associated with it. So we're getting international action, but we're not getting any agreement on the extent of these ownership of these areas. And when we get to the later in the 1940s, we see Mexico claiming jurisdiction over the continental shelf and fishery resources in about 1945, Argentina in 1946, and then Chile in 1947, but Chile decided to claim out to 200 nautical miles, so trying to extend their territories. And then we get the Santiago Declaration, which Chile, Peru and Ecuador claimed 200 nautical miles of sovereign waters off their coast. So these were massive claims, from 3 nautical miles to 200 nautical miles, and obviously very valuable in terms of the fisheries. So 1958 we have, quite famously, the first UN conference on the law of the sea. And there were 3 of these conferences, and they tend to be referred to as UNCLOS 1, 2 and 3. The first in 58, the second in 1960, and the third one in 1973 that went for 9 years. So that was the longest of all of them. But the 1958 conference, again, was trying to get some agreement on these different zones, these different areas. There were, in fact, 4 conventions signed, including Convention on the High Seas, Convention on the Continental Shelf, but still we have the extent of the territorial sea, the bit closest to the coast, was still in dispute. Then in 1958 we get the first of what are called the Cod Wars. So in 1944, I think it was, Iceland had become independent, and it had claimed a territorial sea of about 4 nautical miles. In the first of these Cod Wars, that arose because they extended that 4 nautical mile limit out to 12 nautical miles. And the British didn't like this at all, because they were doing lots of fishing in those waters. The British got very angry and sent in some naval ships to protect their fishery, their fishing trawlers. Iceland equally not happy. So we have this controversy then over the resources in that coastal strip. Then we get, and then there was an agreement that the countries came to out of that. But in 1960 we get this second UN conference on the law of the sea, and really the tension, the conflict, it wasn't taken any further in that conference. There remained significant differences between what the countries claimed as their territorial waters. 1972, Iceland, realising it's still, actually the fisheries were being depleted in these areas that it had agreed to, again seeks to extend its territorial sea out to 50 nautical miles this time. Again, the British don't like this. They come in, and there's a picture there, I think that is from the second, I think that's picture from the second Cod War. So all kinds of nasty things happening. One ship ramming the other, trawling lines being cut, all kinds of aggressive behaviour. Then we get in 1970 to the Montevideo, Lima and Santo Domingo declarations, and in those the Latin American countries again claimed this 12 nautical mile territorial sea, so again extending beyond the 3 to 12 nautical miles, and then a 200 nautical mile patrimonial sea. So this was a whole new area that they were claiming. 1975 we get the third Cod War, and this time Iceland extended its sea out to 200 nautical miles. So 200 nautical miles is now being thrown around as the norm. Britain backed down on that. They didn't argue with that, instead of which they claimed 200 nautical miles of their coast instead to try and match it. And it all led up to this real need to get over the problem, agree on some of these different zones. So there is a book that's about 3 inches thick that's written on that, and so to summarise it in about 2 minutes is very hard. So I'm sure I've missed some things which people would say were very important. But you can see here that the tension leading to different territorial claims, different problems between countries, very valuable fisheries resources, and very close to leading to conflict, serious conflict. It's almost as if they couldn't fail with UNCLOS 3. They could not let this go on. And so this conference went from 1973 to 1982. 585 days of conferencing, which is a long time for anybody. But finally, they did get some agreement at the end of the day. And this is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, often just referred to as UNCLOS, was adopted in 1982, didn't come into force until 1994 though. So it hasn't really been in force all that long. But this is where we get the zones that we all agree upon today. So the territorial sea was agreed upon at 12 nautical miles. So this is the area over which countries own those waters. They have sovereign territory over those waters. The contiguous zone is a little bit extra, and that's really used for the enforcement of customs rules, so you can travel a little bit outside your territory to apprehend somebody that is is wrongly trying to come into your territorial sea. So we don't need to worry too much about the contiguous zone, at least not for marine environmental purposes. But you have 12 nautical miles, then 12 to 200 nautical miles is the exclusive economic zone. And this was a complete creation. It was created. That exclusive economic zone is not a term that was used before. The patrimonial sea had been referred to in South America, but the EEZ was brand new. And so this is not quite the same as the territorial sea. The EEZ gives a country sovereign rights to explore and exploit the resources, in exchange for which they must protect and preserve them. So it gives the coastal state some rights, but does not give them the same ownership as you get in the territorial sea. And then beyond the 200 nautical miles, it's the high seas. And so the high seas has embedded that principle of freedom of the seas, freedom of access, freedom to fish. And herein, I would say, lies some of our problem in terms of protecting those resources. The high seas is just the water column beyond 200 nautical miles. The seabed, the ocean floor, was given a different name, excitingly called the area. Which sounds a little bit futuristic to me, and I've put there the organisation that's supposed to carry out activities is called the Enterprise, so I don't know what they were watching at the time. But the seabed, completely different regime. The seabed was considered to be the common heritage of humankind, meaning no country can own it, and all the benefits of it have to be shared. So mining done on the seabed is controlled through the International Seabed Authority, undertaken by the Enterprise, and the profits shared. Hasn't been all that much mining on the seabed, so we don't have to worry too much about that, but that's the idea. The biggest problem we have is that water column, is the protection of the living resources in the water column. So that's about as many slides as I've got with lots of words on them. Now we get more pictures with any luck. This diagram here explains all those different maritime zones. There are rights in relation to the continental shelf for oil and gas, but again, we're not going to deal with non-living resources. So you can see there, as further you get out from a coastal area, you see the red line at the bottom, the less are the rights of the coastal state. So I think the key thing there, in terms of the exclusive economic zone, is this issue of sovereign rights for exploring and exploiting, conserving and managing the living and non-living resources. And the wording is a little bit deceptive, I think, because the way in which the EEZ works is that each country is supposed to determine the maximum sustainable yield and the total allowable catch or fisheries within that EEZ, and then it can exploit them up to that total allowable catch. So the idea is you can somehow determine, and the scientists in the room will be able to tell me how, determine how many fish there are in your EEZ, what the reproductive rates of those fish are, and therefore what is the maximum sustainable yield. The difficult thing, I think, is the maximum sustainable yield, because if a country cannot exploit all those resources up to that maximum sustainable yield, it has to offer the opportunity to other states to do so. And that means that for countries, Australia may well be able to fish and has enough fishing boats and commercial fisheries to do so. But if you look at some countries, for example, in the South Pacific, which have very large ocean areas, very large EEZs, but may only have a very small fishing fleet, then that opportunity to fish up to that maximum sustainable yield has to be offered to other countries. With the idea, that was the idea of the law of the sea, was that by giving the 200 nautical miles, you were actually giving a benefit to coastal states. And what happens to landlocked states? What happens to the other countries who may only have a small EEZ? I mean, an EEZ is just luck, really. It's luck that Australia has one of the largest in the world, the third largest in the world. It's luck that some countries with very small islands, you calculate the EEZ around the outermost point of those islands. So if you've got 300 islands or 3,000 islands or 10,000 or however many Indonesia or countries have, you're very large areas. So those benefits, the benefits of those fishery resources have to be shared up to that maximum sustainable yield. But of course that's very tricky and that's putting it mildly, I think, to calculate what your maximum sustainable yield is. So how has this developed since then? Of course, 1972 is a very different time, even when that conference started, then 1984 when the UNCLOS was adopted, 82, 1994 when it came into force. Over that period of time you see the environmental movement itself, you see a lot more scientific research in relation to the oceans, we see concepts emerging like sustainable development, which didn't exist before 1987. So over that period of time, we've seen changes, ecosystem-based management, adaptive management, these terms emerging and being embedded in some law. But the law of the sea, the UNCLOS, the convention itself, is fairly static. Now, to a certain extent, they recognised this at the time, and so UNCLOS is about, again, has hundreds of articles within it, it's a huge document. They knew that didn't cover everything that needed to be covered. So UNCLOS really just divides up the ocean into these zones, creates requirements for each of the zones, including the high seas, with obligations for each country to make some effort to protect and preserve the high seas through regulating its nationals, its ships. There's a little bit of detail about pollution, because marine pollution from ships and dumping of waste was an issue at the time, perhaps a bigger issue than fisheries at the time. But in relation to fishery management, there are only these very vague, very limited obligations to protect and preserve. It was recognised that we needed to have more agreements after that. And that's in fact what we have had. We've had the fish stocks agreement since then in relation to migratory species. Basically, the underlying principle in UNCLOS was that countries should cooperate. They should cooperate whether either regionally or in relation to a specific issue like migratory species, etc. So when we look at what law governs marine species today, it is, you could say, some people would say fragmented, other people would say it is just comprehensive over a range of agreements. Depends which way you want to look at it. The law of the sea, as I said, creates those zones, but it's regional fishery management organisations, regional agreements that really control fishing and fishery resources in different parts of the world. And so that's our utilisation of the oceans. So we have regional fishery management agreements in relation to utilisation, but in relation to conservation, we have environmental law, marine environmental law, including the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, the Convention on Migratory Species. So we have UNCLOS talking about conservation and utilisation, but what we have seen since then is parallel regimes developing. Fisheries regimes developing separately from conservation regimes. So this is just a diagram illustrating how large the high seas are and how big a problem it is. The dark blue areas are all high seas. And the high seas is beyond the jurisdiction of any one country, can't be owned by anybody, freedom to fish, freedom of access, freedom of navigation, limited only by the requirement of all states to protect and preserve it, quite generally. Okay, no specificity about how that is to be done in the law of the sea. This is a wonderful diagram that I found just the other day. This sets out some of the agreements, just to show you everything in international law is an acronym, so you don't have to say anything in full name. So you can see there some of the agreements, and so it is a very complex regime. We can't just say it's the law of the sea, that just is the foundation for what followed. So if you just look at our part of the world here, you can see the Indian Ocean. The IOTC is the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission. So this is one of these regional fishery management organisations that controls tuna fishing. So the parties to that convention include regional parties, plus any country that is fishing in that area. But at the end of the day, whatever is agreed to, and they do often agree to conservation management measures, in my case, the work I'm doing at the moment in relation to sharks, they've got some conservation management measures in relation to what sharks can be taken and what can't. It relies upon each state to enforce that against its own nationals and against its own vessels. So a vessel is a little part of the country that you're travelling from. So vessels are flagged and registered in one country, and the crew might come from different countries. And that all works well if you're a fabulous country like Australia and you do regulate your nationals and your ships, but some countries do take a stronger or a weaker approach to that regulation. So we see these different fishery bodies, quite a few there, the West Indian Ocean Tuna, Southwest Indian Ocean Fisheries Commission, and then in the south, the Southern Bluefin Tuna Commission as well, looking at just at the bluefin tuna. So those fishery agreements regulate some areas, some nationals, some people in some areas, but they don't, because the ocean can't be owned, they can't control a complete area. They're controlling an activity in an area, and they're controlling people who are taking part in that activity. In addition to that, in the clear boxes, the square clear boxes, we see another whole regime develop. So the regional fishery management organisations developed under FAO, under the Food and Agriculture Organisation, which is part of the United Nations. The other treaties developed under UNEP, United Nations Environment Programme, and they are principally the regional seas conventions to do with pollution. So that's how a lot of them, their focus, their original focus. We see famously the OSPAR Convention in Europe, north of the UK there, is one of those. We have a South Pacific one to the east as well. So these could be overlapping, the areas could be overlapping. It's not as if we divide up the ocean and say the Regional Fishery Management Organisation works here and the regional seas work there. They are overlapping, and they can create, ideally, they would create synergistic regimes. And OSPAR, certainly in Europe, they've had some success here by having one fishery management treaty and a pollution treaty working synergistically together to protect the habitat of species as well as the activities in terms of fishing. That's probably the high point at the moment in terms of where in the world we're doing that. But certainly that's a fairly recent development that we see as a way forward, if you like, for protection of different species. As I said, we have the different marine environmental law treaties as well. So in the middle, CITES, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. And that controls trade between countries. So it was originally designed to address the problem of elephant ivory and the export and import of that. We've seen it being used to list species, and it works on a listing basis, to list species, most species of whales listed there that are protected under that convention as well as the International Convention on the Regulation of Whaling. But what we've seen in the last couple of years, certainly in relation to the work that I do, is the difficulty of getting a species like shark, or some species of shark, listed under that treaty. Because on the one hand you get the fishing nations that want to regulate shark fisheries under the regional fishery management conventions, and then you see the more conservation-focused nations wanting to list the species here under this treaty. And the way international law works, it works on consensus. It works on countries voting. And in most cases you need at least a 2/3 majority to get something listed or something protected. So where you've got countries that have very different political agenda and economic agenda, it can be a significant problem. Convention on Migratory Species, again another global conservation treaty here that protects not just marine species but land-based and birds as well. But at the same time, we're seeing, and I've got along the bottom the IUCN Red List marker, we see more species becoming extinct or critically endangered. And where you have the high seas, an open access regime essentially, it creates a significant barrier to any country or any group of countries taking control of that area and protecting the species. So I just wanted to speak about a few critical issues. I won't speak about the first three. The first three are definitely important for law of the sea. Piracy remains a difficult problem. Sovereign claims, we know the South China Sea, and anybody who's had a look at that has seen the South China Sea still dispute, and different countries claim different areas. This is a significant problem where countries are not 400 nautical miles apart. So for Australia, we can't in the north of Australia, but certainly to the south, we can draw our EZ. But where you've got the South China Sea, you have to get a median line between all those countries' different EZs. So if you're less than 400 nautical miles, you just find the median. Now, if that was just a straight border, that would be fine. But all you need is one little island out in the ocean, and you can say, well, I'm going to draw my border around that island. And the law of the sea has special rules about that, and it talks about requiring a habitable rock, or a rock to be habitable in order for it to count for the purpose of calculating baseline. Now, what you see if you Google this and look at some images, some of them are quite amusing, where a little rock that was just poking out of the ocean now has a giant platform on it, and or 6 or 7 people with machine guns standing on it whose feet are getting wet at high tide. These are some of the disputes. Less so for Australia. Australia's come to an agreement with Papua New Guinea in relation to its northern sea borders, but other countries are less accommodating. Pollution and oil spills we know is still a problem, and we do have some significant treaties in this area, the Marpol Treaty on shipping and the London Convention on dumping of waste at sea. These are older laws, 1970s, 1980s, these laws were adopted. And that was all well and good when we knew less about ocean currents, less about the reproduction of species at sea, away from the coastlines. But some of the rules, for example, which require the dumping of ballast water at a certain distance off the coast, those we know a lot more now than we knew back then when those laws were adopted. And so I often say that law moves at a glacial speed. It certainly doesn't respond terribly quickly to some of this new science that's emerging. But the 3 I wanted to focus on today, illegal fishing, shark finning because it's close to my own heart, and marine spatial planning, which is something I've been working on with some people who are in this room at the Oceans Institute here at UWA. So illegal, what they call IUU fishing, is illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And this principally occurs on the high seas. It can occur illegally, of course, within the EEZ of any one country. But, and because it's very difficult to police, it's very difficult to monitor what fishing is happening, particularly if you've got a very large ocean area. So the way in which fishing, as I said, is really regulated, this IUU fishing is regulated is through the FAO Regional Fishery Management Organisation agreements. But it's not as simple as saying, well, we're just going to watch who's legally fishing with a licence and who's not legally fishing. We know that the high seas is open to everybody. You are allowed to fish there. If you're going to say, okay, we're going to pass conservation management measures within a regional fishery management convention, then what you're doing is passing specific laws in relation to specific species or at specific times of the year or the use of specific equipment. And particularly when it comes down to the species, we've got all kinds of problems in terms of the people on board the ships being able to correctly identify species, whether they're properly counting the species they're catching, and we've got huge problems of discards or bycatch, catching the wrong species and then throwing them away. So when you bring your ship back to port and your catch is calculated, it may well be that you don't have anything illegal on board, but how much has been discarded, how much is wasted? Have you been legally fishing in certain areas? Have you been illegally fishing in other waters? There's a lot more work to be done in this area, and I think it's the work needs to be interdisciplinary. Law is not going to solve this problem by itself. We need the scientists, and particularly I think there's a lot more use could be made of technology. And I read with interest on the weekend about a pilot program in Palau. Palau has a massive EEZ, but only one patrol boat for the whole country. It's a very poor country. But there's a pilot program at the moment to use unmanned drones to film and over different areas and to look at what fishing is being conducted, take pictures of ships, etc. That's just one example I read on the weekend of the use of technology, but what we need to do is to really have the disciplines work together in terms of science, technology, all of these different areas, as well as the political scientists to address some of the underlying political problems. The issue of shark finning is a little bit, well, it's definitely connected with illegal, unregulated, non-reported fishing. But the shark finning, 10, 20, 30 years ago, we weren't having these types of pictures. You weren't seeing this volume of shark fin being harvested. Because sharks are often not the target species, they are caught as bycatch. But because they are now so valuable, they are kept. And the real risk here, of course, is that there's only so many. If you were to catch the whole shark and bring the trunk of the shark back as a meat to be sold, that's taking up a lot of room on board your ship, where you can cut the fins off and bring just the fins back. You can pack a lot more into your hold. So the way in which the international community's tried to address this is by in the last decade or so, by passing rules to say that we should have a fin to carcass ratio, a ratio of the amount of the calculation of percentage of fins you'll bring back, calculated on a percentage ratio as to what that would equate to in terms of the sharks. That's not terribly helpful and has been criticised because it would depend upon the shark, it depends upon the size of the fin, it depends if the fins are wet or dry and how these things are calculated. So there's a move around the world really now to require sharks to be landed whole. So rather than remove the fin before you come back to port, to come back with the whole shark. There's a lot of resistance to this in some parts of the world, certainly a lot of resistance by some of the biggest shark fishing nations to do that. But what is quite clear, I think, is that the harvest levels we see now are just not sustainable in anyone's terms. It's just not possible. And I equally don't think that a ban on shark fins is necessarily going to solve the problem, because when you ban things, you tend to get black markets. So we need to be, very sophisticated, I think, in the approach that we take. So this is a problem that's going to, I think, be with us for a little while longer. The interesting thing, of course, is that 10, 15 years ago, Ryan might tell me otherwise, but there wasn't as much public support for the protection of sharks that we see today. We're seeing a lot more public interest in this issue in particular. Perhaps because we can see these pictures, whereas in the past we didn't see the picture. The last issue I want to come down to is more one that's closer to home, I think, and that relates to the actual governance over our ocean areas. So in terms of the way we've managed the ocean, we've tended to follow the same pattern at home that we have internationally. So we have fishery regulation, we have oil and gas platform regulation, we have shipping laws, and I think in Western Australia you've got about 47 pieces of legislation that govern different uses of the ocean quite close to shore. In terms of conservation, we have tended to just take the measures, the mechanisms we've used on land and transpose them on the ocean. So we've taken our national park and we've created a marine park on the oceans. Now, there's a couple of issues with that. Firstly, the ocean is not the same as land. First of all, it's three-dimensional, and a very two-dimensional approach, which is the approach that has historically been taken, won't necessarily work in the ocean. Also, species are much more mobile, and we have, because of this underlying concept of freedom of the seas and access to everybody, tends to create a lot of tensions and conflicts when governments try and impose a conservation area over what many people consider to be a common pool resource, a resource that should be available to everybody. So what excites lawyers a little bit is looking at innovative ways in which to try and overcome this. And we've looked at this from a marine spatial planning point of view. This is the current concept that's getting a lot of traction around the world. And that is to look at the way we manage land. We zone different areas, we divide them all up, but we are more holistic in the approach we take. We could take a holistic three-dimensional approach in the ocean as well. So we could divide up the ocean into areas for aquaculture leases, minerals and energy, shipping. We could have different depths. So you may have fishing at the surface, but protection of there's a shipwreck there, protection of heritage at the sea floor. We could have a three-dimensional zoned approach, which would require, of course, us overriding a lot of the rules that we already have in place. So it certainly wouldn't be something that could be done very easily. But we have seen some of this marine spatial planning on the high seas, in and around that OSPAR convention area I mentioned before. And that's the first area in which we've seen high seas marine protected areas. And we've got the Pollution Convention there, working together with the Fisheries Convention to basically say, let's divide up this portion of the ocean. We can have some benthic protection, we can have some drilling here and there for oil and gas. On the surface we might have pelagic fishing, the water column in the middle might be protected in a different way. So different depths taken into account, and trying to address both this problem of conservation and utilisation in the one document. And this has historically proved very difficult. We've tended to separate the use we make of the ocean and its resources from the conservation of them. So some of the examples of a few things, dividing up this three-dimensional area into different uses, so not just horizontally zoned, but vertically zoned as well. Now in the high seas, you could say in one sense it's harder to do, but in other senses it's easier to do, because we don't have any sovereign rights in those areas. When you're talking about state rights and state waters in Australia or other countries, it might be a bit tricky. But this is one of the things we're looking at, how this could be achieved, or at least, at the very least, how you could get better synergies between different pieces of legislation. So one is not pulling against the other, that we're not getting the goal of one piece of legislation undermining another. And it is tricky to do because often the government departments, the agencies, are in separate areas as well. So they're not even talking about the same people who are managing the areas. So that's really all I wanted to say today. I just wanted to give you a bit of a background on the history of the law of the sea, and I hope that I've done that. And to just talk about some of the reasons why we have this open access approach to the oceans, why it is so difficult to get agreement to manage, particularly something like the high seas. I don't think we have a shortage of law or policy in this area. We have plenty of law. What we need to do is to make it work better with itself so that there's synergies between the laws, but also work better with industry, work better with people whose livelihoods depend upon the oceans as well, and obviously work better with the knowledge that we now have about marine species in terms of where they live, where they travel to, what their conservation needs are. So I hope I've given you some indication of what law is all about and why it's important in this area, and I'm happy to answer any questions at all. Thank you.